to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
We're back
Back together.
We were mysteriously absent for a week.
We haven't, the three of
only
us.
our true fans were wondering where we were last week.
Yeah.
Others were just like, oh, you guys were gone?
Yeah. Our guest was sick, unable to make it last minute, so
yeah,
we missed you.
Unforeseen circumstances, but if you're wondering if your podcast feed was broken, it was not. We just weren't there.
And we were okay.
Yeah, we were fine. Yeah.
But I'm wondering if, like, we say we have a podcast every Friday and nobody's going to trust us anymore.
I think that they might have lost their trust in us. That's a good point.
Might be a little shaky.
I feel like distrust is growing in culture in general, whether it's social media or the news or any type of media consumption that's out there. Then you have AI with deepfakes and so on, and that does lead us to what our topic is today, and that's the growing distrust that we have in our culture and like what we're experiencing on a daily basis, and who can we trust and why should we trust. And there's a lot of nuance there, whether that's the government or news media or churches or broader institutions. It does feel like a lot of that trust is eroded, whether there's scandals that come out or moral failings. There's just a lot in general that I think it's tough as Christians to navigate that. And I think a fair amount of skepticism is okay, but I think it's when we let that skepticism kind of fester in our hearts and turn into cynicism where it really becomes a problem. So that's kind of the thesis of today's episode.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, and I don't know that numbers are out, but I think of really the pandemic, I feel like in a big way was one of those teeter-totter moments for a lot of just trust. I mean, whether that is in media, churches. I mean, I know for us as a church, there was, depending on what you thought about masks or a shot or all of those kinds of things, people would just like totally trust or distrust you or that with that. Or around the same time as a church, we were, wrestling through, our elders were, and people were wrestling through men and women in ministry. And, there's people that trusted and gave and served at this church for decades. But then our elders came out, with just a thought that was maybe different on a few passages around women in leadership. And it's like all of that trust, for a lot of people just kind of went out the door. And then you've got, we in the last episode that we did, I believe was with Steph Juliot from the Pour Over. We even talked about just so much media and news outlets, and you're just getting it from everywhere that it just becomes more, there's so many more things to trust, and therefore so many more things to distrust, honestly. And so, but it definitely feels like, I would say for me, like if I think of the last 6 years, have I become less trusting of major institutions? I'd probably say I've definitely at least become more skeptical for sure.
Or maybe you just like take a beat before you just buy into whatever somebody says or not. But I think you guys make a good point about even thinking about the pandemic. People had to trust that they would have a job, that they would have a paycheck to support their family, and especially like as people have made more looks inward about mental health and, what's going on with me. And there's kind of been a rise about that. It's like, okay, I'm trusting that, how I feel is actually how I feel, and how what you're saying to me actually means what you're saying. And so I think that it's kind of like a slippery slope too, when we're surrounded by a lot of things that now we're questioning. And it's sometimes even like the more you know you don't know. So then it's like, what do you know? And so we're kind of sat in this spot where it's like, okay, what do you do? Where do you put your faith/trust? Like, how much can you really rely on the next thing that's happening, especially when it's like super solid things that we've never questioned before that now we kind of get to question.
Some of the stats on this are about 22% of Americans trust the federal government to do what is right most or all of the time. About 28% trust the mass media, and about 36% of the population trusts churches. So I think it's easy to say that confidence is in major institutions is kind of at an all-time low. And I think you're right. Like we've talked about it I think you're right, Alex, like in context of the pandemic. I think also social media as it relates to American culture, where we really strive for independence and to like individuality is kind of the pinnacle of American culture and what we claim is what it is to be an American. And you kind of go from there and you go, okay, well, social media has given everybody a platform to be their own source of information. And so then you have a lot of people who are scrolling social media and just looking at personalities and the personalities they align with. And they go, okay, well, I trust this person, so I'm going to listen to what they say no matter what information they're going off of. And so then you kind of lose the ability to fact check or if you do fact check and then maybe it's like, well, on Snopes, it says this. Well, Snopes is a liberal media source, or whatever. So you just start, there's all these small like micro biases that come into play. And then who do you go to? What do we, and I think even Christians in some ways, we kind of muddy that water a little bit more because this is going to sound cynical and I don't mean for it to, but I think this is what an outsider would look at Christians as, is like, oh, you're talking to your imaginary friend about what's going on in culture and getting answers that way. Like, how am I going to trust that? Right. And I think that's that kind of cynical worldly view that they're going to have is that, as a Christian, like one of our core tenets is prayer. And so obviously we're going to be seeking God for wisdom. But I think even that for someone who's a non-believer brings about a lot of distrust because they don't understand that concept or they don't understand like what that means to have a personal relationship with Christ. So I think a lot of times as Christians, we need to err on the side of caution when we're communicating things that are more in the physical realm, like let's rely on true trusted sources instead of trying to kind of manipulate that for our own agendas, if that makes sense.
I'm curious if we side with the majority or minority on each of these, like for you guys, and I'll answer first for each of them. Like, do you trust the federal government to do what's right all or most of the time? I'm going to go with a no on that.
Really, it's surprising, Alex.
That's my vote.
Yeah.
Where are you guys? A yes or no?
Do I trust the federal government to do what is right?
All or most of the time?
Yeah, I think, man, that's a tough one because I think people ask that question and their minds immediately go to a person probably in the federal government, whether that's the president or their mayor or their governor or like someone specific, and maybe you do trust that person or you align with that person's ideologies, but then as a whole, it's like, yeah, it's hard to know what to trust. And I think because we have departments in the government that have military going out into helicopters in the middle of a hurricane to try to measure that and help us predict weather and help people stay safe, or all these little things that we trust on a daily basis to just work. Over the air TV, AM radio, there's stuff that like the government oversees in its own way, right? That we trust every day and we don't even think about it. We don't bat an eye. So to say you don't trust the government is kind of crazy. But do I trust these certain individuals that do shady things and maybe lie or try to manipulate the culture into thinking things that aren't true? No, I don't trust that.
So the box you checked is yes or no. I
know, and that's why I think it's so nuanced. Okay, I don't know how you just answer that question.
I think too, when we're talking about, it says 22% of Americans trust the federal government to do what's right most or all of the time. It depends what your definition of right is in this case.
Sure.
So
I'm the only one checking a box.
And
But I'm
also
just
depends
I'm
on
just saying there is such a nuance
if
because
you are
what's
if
right
you are
because
hardline Republican or Democrat, it's like who's sitting on the throne at that moment.
yeah.
Because they might, if they love Donald Trump, they might just check the box when they answered it during his term. But if it, during Biden's term, they might not check that. You know what I mean? It's just you don't.
Yes.
I think there's just so much that goes into that.
My
Mass
heart
media. You
You didn't let her answer.
I was just gonna say my
sorry.
heart wants
I
to
rambled too
say yes that I trust it. Like if we're just giving our answer, I want to say yes really bad.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is a space where it's like enough has happened in different areas, like local government, all the way to federal, where it's
Yeah.
like I'm skeptical.
Yeah, for
I don't
sure.
know. I would say that I am more distrusting, or I would be like, I'm not just going to take that at its word. I need a little more information, and that's just. I think I've been created in that melting pot too. Okay, so mass media, Alex. You're always
I'm gonna
sending
go no.
us. You're always.
I'm going no as
he's
well.
always sending us links
I'm
of
2 for 2.
TMZ.
Only trust the church. That'll be a preview for you.
Okay. Yeah, I don't. I mean, again, it's just I don't like answering these questions. They're too nuanced.
They're uncomfy, aren't they?
Well, they just don't think they're a yes or no question, an answer. You can't just say yes or no. Do I trust the media?
Alex is
well, it
making
depends
us.
on what the.
yeah.
No, I mean, I was just
Who's
trying
the
to
mass
get where
media?
the numbers are.
But
you know?
yes, I would say no. I mean, if I do not feel wise if I just open up Facebook or open up Google and it's like this is the headline and I just take that for 100% what it is. So no.
I definitely don't on Facebook. I'll say that much.
Yeah, or just like whatever you're gonna.
I mean, there's so much. I mean, I see people sharing AI generated news anchor avatars all the time of news that I mean, I don't know where they're coming up with stuff and people are believing it. And so it's just, yeah, I don't know. I think what's mass media? What is that? Are we talking about Fox and CNN? Are we talking about social media? Are we talking, that stuff is tough to answer. So I don't know. I guess no. I mean, I think and maybe that's why people lean so negative with it because they don't really know what people mean by this, when they're being asked these questions.
Yeah, and my guess is just major news stations.
Yeah.
I mean that's what, at least in my mind, and the church.
Mm-hmm.
And again, yeah, like you guys have said, there's so much nuance into what that means because there's definitely churches I distrust or I have an empathy for people that distrust, churches for a lot of reasons. We talked, or Jess, you had a conversation a couple weeks ago with Kate and just talked about, spiritual abuse and some of the things that can happen there. And that's just being called out more and more light is shed on that. But in some ways that actually gives me more trust in churches when there is more of a microscope or more of a spotlight on some of the failures because it's, I guess, clearing out. I mean, I think any place you work or anything that you give your life to, I think you want the frauds to get called out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, in some ways, though it's disheartening and disappointing anytime I read of an author that fell from grace or had a fall or whatever, there's also this part of me that's good because that is being revealed and put in the light too. So
I mean, I think part of my story is getting the job here almost, a little over 9 years ago. And I grew up in small churches. I spent a lot of time in like church plants and different things like that. My only connection to a church this size was negative press, right? Like you just saw like, oh, they're bad at managing money. They're bad, they're whatever. There's going to be skeletons in the closet,
seeker
right?
sensitive. They don't really care about the gospel.
They water down the gospel, all that stuff. And I think when I started here, I if I'm being full, I wouldn't have said anything at the time, but I was definitely like peeking in closets going, okay, where's the truth at? Like they can't be what they say they are. I mean, I wanted to believe it, but I also just felt like, no, everything I've learned to this point would show that a church, I mean, I don't know if we're quite mega church classification, but we're close. I mean, there's got to be something.
And next
here.
week's episode is everything Eric found in the closet.
Yeah. No, but I think that was the part that really was
Christmas.
it was a healing thing for me because there's there's so much accountability in the leadership, whether that's governing boards, stewardship teams, management teams, message teams that go over like what's being taught every week, the transparency in the finances, the care for missions, whether that's what they're doing for the city or what they're doing globally, the money that's donated to global missions. I mean, there's just so much here at this church. And I mean, I guess I'm bragging on CCC a little bit, but I also just think that was something that was healing for me to go, okay, this is an area of my life that I always thought I was supposed to not trust, and to see that, yeah, it's not perfect. Nothing's perfect. But there's a lot of hope in that to me, that like, okay, not every large organization is corrupt.
Yeah.
I will say that I also have experienced, I would say, a solid decade of church hurt that actually made me leave the church in college for a couple years. And so for me, I have a lot of empathy for people that are, reading the headlines or they're hearing these stories. And I think that one of the ways that kind of has brought me back to church and learning like what can I trust is by being involved. And I think the ability to like question leadership or having like confidence to go up and say, okay, what did this mean? Or I think even getting involved in community has helped me say, do I trust the church? I trust our church.
Yeah.
So then when there's a questionable, when you are involved and you're kind of a little bit more in the weeds, whether that's volunteering or in a small group, then when there's a decision that you don't understand, it's like, I don't understand that, but I trust these people because I am talking to them on a regular basis, or I'm involved, or I'm paying attention. So I think like being in community helps you trust the church, but I have a lot of empathy for people that struggle in that area. And I think that conversation with Kate was so helpful and valid in a lot of people's stories. So
Yeah.
I think that's makes sense. Do we think those are low numbers? I mean, 22% for the government, 36% for trusting in churches. That seems pretty low. I mean, that's almost 75% of people that are walking around saying,
Yeah,
I'm questioning
the 22%
this.
in government, it says it's an all-time low.
That's
And the church rate is also something that's fallen over the past few decades. So.
Yeah, I mean, those are low numbers. And again, I think, if people are answering it based off of a quick whim and what they've seen and experienced either personally or in headlines, then I think none of them are shocking. I do think it feels like the posture of people overall is more of like distrust before trust. Like, you have to earn my trust. Like, trust isn't given, and then you earn my distrust. That old, watching Cops, and you're like, they give you that little disclaimer, everyone is innocent until proven guilty, but you're like, you made it pretty clear that they're guilty before, It just seems like that benefit of the doubt is not something that's given, a lot in these today. And so I'm trying to think like through my own, and it probably is depending on the organization or the person, like how much I bend towards an automatic trust versus towards a distrust. And I want to think, at least in my own mind, that like I assume the best, and I assume that I'm giving trust before somebody causes me to have a reason to distrust. But I don't know, I could be wrong there. But I assume most people, if they come into my office and want to talk about something or share something, that I'm giving them like, I'm trusting you as a valid source until I hear something different from whatever it is, at least interpersonally.
So part of this equation with trust is how skepticism, discernment, and cynicism play into that tension. And I think many Christians hear trust and assume that skepticism is wrong or not allowed, or that means you don't have faith, right? Like, I think that's, and I mean, one of the things that I've always kind of been passionate about is like the difference between criticism and cynicism. And I think this kind of plays in that same lane, where a lot of times people will be like, oh, you're being critical of everything. You're being critical, or you're being a critic or whatever. And they say that as if it's a bad thing. And I honestly think you can only get better. Institutions can only get better. Systems can only get better with criticism. If you don't criticize what is wrong, if you don't point that out and you aren't critical about the problems, it's not going to get better. But people hear criticism come out of someone's mouth, and if they don't know what they're listening for, they can immediately assume it's cynicism and turn it off right away and just not listen. And I think there's a big difference. Cynicism doesn't offer a solution. So, and I think that's where a lot of times you can tell the difference between whether someone is cynical or critical. If they're being critical, a lot of times they are criticizing what's wrong with something, but they're offering a solution to the problem within that. And you can usually sense that in their passion for it. Or cynicism tends to just sound like a constant stream of negativity and, almost to the point of just no hope at all, right?
Yep, I would agree with that too.
And so I think that's where I think words are important because they are what, they serve a purpose. And so when you lump everyone who's critical into cynical, you're doing people a great injustice. But I think that also falls, then when you add skepticism in there, I think that's probably a word that's used much more commonly when it comes to faith. And so should Christians be skeptical? Again, I think it's kind of in that critical vein. Like, yeah, you should be. You should ask questions. You should challenge leadership. You should, in a respectful way, right? And a lot of times I think the moment someone encounters someone who's being skeptical, they want to shut it down and say, oh, you're being cynical. You just need to trust.
Yeah.
You just need to trust XYZ, this organization. You just need to trust Jesus. You just need to trust. And it's like, yeah, that's true. But, how are we supposed to grow? How are we supposed to better ourselves if we can't ask tough questions and start to navigate those and kind of build those neural pathways on our own?
Yep, exactly. I also think that when we hear skepticism or someone that's being critical, it's good to turn inward and say, am I hearing that from somebody as like a fact about where they're coming from, or am I just feeling defensive right away? Because when we hear something from somebody, if we become defensive, then we lose their message as well. And so I think that it's okay to sit with someone in their skepticism. I always interact a lot with, therapists that are students and even my kids. And it's like, when they're questioning something, it's like, I want to be able to answer those questions and welcome that. Cause I think that a lot of times that's where we grow when we're kind of thinking and saying like, is that right? Like that critical thinking piece that our brain latches onto is like, that's so good. That's so growing. That's kind of like taking a thought that is somebody else's and saying, how is this mine? And how am I going to interact with this in my own life and in my brain and how I cognitively understand that? And so I think that there's a lot of growth and goodness that can come out of being skeptical. I think the piece that can come into this is like negativity, and we can go really negative with it, but I don't think that there's a problem with that.
And there's whole literature in scripture, wisdom literature that helps us, I think, navigate, the Proverbs, especially Ecclesiastes, like helps us navigate the reality of life and wisdom and having discernment and not always trusting in everything, not even trusting in our own selves. The scripture in Proverbs says, lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge, trust in God, and He'll direct your path. And so there's even this invitation from Jesus to, that our hearts can be full of folly and they can lead us astray, and that we have to anchor our hope and our faith in Him. And, scripture talks about testing everything, putting things to the test, not believing every spirit, and talking about Antichrist in the letters that John wrote, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And so scripture encourages us towards, and I think it's just, how we hear, and I think how you frame that, Eric, towards skepticism or towards asking questions, demanding answers. And I think the difference between someone who's skeptical that says they're asking for the evidence versus someone who's cynical is like, nothing's ever going to convince me. And if you go into the same kind of conversation with, show me the evidence, maybe, you feel like, okay, I need to show that, and you can feel like maybe that's abrasive. But then if someone just comes into the conversation and they're like, I'm never going to believe it. There's no point in having the conversation at that point. And I think, yeah, that's definitely what a difference between cynicism and skepticism looks like. And it does feel like in our world, there are more and more people that it seems like have led or leaned more towards cynicism, you know, when it comes to a lot of this distrust than just skepticism.
I mean, I think in my personal walk, like one of the things I always struggled with, and I still sometimes do struggle with it, is I love the gotcha question. Like I love asking people those tough like scenario questions that, oh, you can't answer this, you can't get that answer to me because this is a really challenging question. But I think what I've learned to check is when it is me being cynical or someone else being cynical, it's like what they do when the challenging answer or the challenging question is responded to with the challenging answer. Like when that answer challenges you and you don't know necessarily what to do with that and you have to wrestle with that a minute, or it convicts you or whatever. I think that's where you can kind of tell like if this person's being a skeptic or a cynic, because I think if they take it and go, okay, now I'm going to wrestle with this, or if they just try to discredit a challenging answer, I think it's something to. It's at least a way of being aware of like where people's hearts are in those conversations. Yeah. What are some other examples you guys see in this? Like where do you see, or if you want specifically, we haven't talked a lot about discernment, but where do you see discernment playing a role in all of this? Because I do think discernment's kind of that, it's like that personal argument a lot of times, because it's like, well, you might be discerning something differently than I am discerning it. And I think that gets pretty messy, but I don't know. I mean, I think sometimes people use discernment as a kind of a barrier to avoid any vulnerability, you know, or a safeguard from a number of things, because it's like, oh, I'm discerning this, and that can kind of sometimes, I mean, I'm hesitant to use discernment a lot of times in arguments, because it's kind of like playing the God card to a certain extent. Like God told me this, and then it's like, okay, well, that's the end of that conversation.
Yeah, I think a big part of discernment is, I think people definitely can and do have the gift of discernment, but I think the people that do have the gift of discernment have enough discernment to invite others into the conversation. And I think that's a big part of it. So I think the people that claim they have the gift of discernment and it's like isolated discernment is like the people I'm skeptical of, honestly, because the people that I see with the most discernment, I think of, you know, some of the people that come into my mind, like a Wendell Nelson, Dr. Wendell Nelson here, and other people that I will go and ask, you know, questions that I'm wrestling through. I really trust their answers, but they have this degree of humility in the way that they're offering discernment and offering, you know, wrestling through something. And a lot of times it's maybe not even giving a full answer, but it's inviting you to pray with them through it or to wrestle through it longer than just getting an answer. But the people that I go to that you're like, they're just so confident, you know, it's just like, boom, I know, and here's where it is, and there's just that aura about them that they feel like they know everything and they are all discerning. Like those are the people I'm like, yeah, you think you've got the gift of, and I do think that there's people that do have the gift of discernment, that just stop exercising it well, you know, and I think part of exercising it well is using it with humility and using it, you know, in, you know, discernment with other people, inviting the Spirit into it, not being rushed and fast. And so there's people that I've known, and I'm like, man, I used to really trust them. I used to really go to them in discernment, but somewhere along the lines, they just wanted to sidestep all of the other parts of the process, asking the Spirit to be moving, asking other people for their wisdom and insight in that I think along the way, they take something that is a God-given gift, and we can all do this in ways, and then kind of make it a bigger thing, or they... It's
so abrasive, too, when they approach it that way.
Yeah, 100%.
It can kind of come off as mind reading or like, okay, tell me this real quick. Okay, I have the answer. Or, okay, I've got this quick conclusion, and I don't think that that's necessarily what discernment looks like. Discernment looks like pausing and kind of and almost like weighing the emotional reaction and looking at the two sides and perceiving the two sides and not necessarily being threatened by either.
It's analytical.
And kind of being able to sit with that and say, okay, I'm going to withhold like some emotional reactivity and process that a little bit. And that's where I think where we see that very calm, wise, confident piece in discernment where we can really like up that and I think abuse it or misuse it in other people where it's like, okay, well, you said that. Well, I'm feeling like this or that about Eric because Eric's acting like this. So he's this today. And that's also a way for people to get people to not listen to you and not hear you. And dare I say, not trust you.
Yeah. Well, and I think the question for the church, I mean, that's what we have to wrestle through is like, what are ways that we can continue to build trust? If we know, hey, this is where we're at, you know, basically 1 in every 3 people trusts the institution of the church. And honestly, I think that's a big heart of all 3 of us and why we have these conversations, why we have this podcast, why we invite people that we agree, disagree with, why we want to have these conversations and are willing to dive into the nuance is because this stuff matters, you know, to talk about, like you did a couple weeks ago, Jess, church hurt, to talk about, you know, media, to talk about, you know, people that are leaving the faith, to talk about a lot of the things that we do is because we want to be a place that's open and honest, that's willing to have uncomfortable conversations, that's willing to dialogue through all these things and not just monologue all of our opinions. And I think, you know, that's one of the steps. Like I hope something like this is, and I've from people, whether it's feedback from people in the church or just, you know, people as I talk about this podcast or guests that we've had on, you know, that seems to be an overwhelming, you know, thought of, man, I think that's so cool that you guys are willing to have those conversations, be wrong, be right, invite others to be a part of it. And so I think micro things like this are hopefully, at least in our world, with this little sphere of influence we have, are ways to, you know, continue to build and gain that trust.
Well, and I think a big part of gaining trust is admitting when you're wrong. Like if you're not willing to admit that you're wrong, then why would someone trust you? So if you always are right and then you try to deflect or, you know, justify the times that you are called out for being incorrect or wrong, people are going to lose trust immediately. And I think the thing about the church is a lot of times the truth that the church tells often invites discomfort, all right? Like the conviction of the Holy Spirit. It invites life change. It invites opportunities for you to make a change in your life, and which I think is good and great and beautiful. And one of my favorite things about the church and the way that my life changes and the way I get to see new believers' lives change in that process. But I also think we kind of like are stuck against this culture that you know, you have this idea of, oh, just tell them like it is. Like you need to tell the truth. The church needs to really just be honest and tell these people they're living in sin. And it's like, I want to understand their heart when they say those things. I want to understand like where they're coming from and their position, and that they probably care about people and they care about their eternal soul and they care about those types of things. But I think it's the mechanism in which they deliver that message that comes across so abrasive. And it's like, I think you're missing the point, because it's not, the truth changes people, but it's not the fact that you are right or correct that makes it good, you know? And I think a lot of times we want to take this idea of I'm right, you're wrong, I'm good, you're bad, and then that's it. And I think it's like, well, no, when you invite people to meet Jesus, there is an element of the Holy Spirit that takes over and starts to change their lives. And you know what? We get to be a part of that process. We get to like walk alongside them. We get to walk alongside Jesus in that process as they invite him into their lives. And that's the part that I think as Christians, we should really relish in and really explain and cherish and uplift and all of those types of things. But often it ends up being this idea of just like, a club-fisted manner of just hitting someone over the head with an idea or telling people they're wrong. And that's really what's going to get them to change. And that's never worked ever. It doesn't matter. I mean, there's no room for the Holy Spirit in that conversation. There's no room for them to make a decision. And that's what Jesus has been offering people ever since he was a man on the earth, is offering people the option to choose him, and telling someone that they need to choose Jesus is not giving them that opportunity to make that decision themselves.
I think the church can gain a lot of ground when we look even at what we're talking about today, where it's like people are distrusting the government. They are distrusting the church. They are questioning mass media, etc. Like there's a lot of insecurity in our world and in the makeup of what we go through all the hours of the week. So when we're showing up in church, I think church leaders, don't be surprised if people are edgy and they're questioning and they're uncomfortable. And also, like, for me, like, Jess, you're going to show up and you're going to feel edgy and you're going to feel uncomfortable and you're going to feel skeptical, because that's kind of the world and the culture that we're living in. And I think our base that we have to come back to is so right, Eric, where it's like Jesus himself was discerning and he did not let skepticism or distrust affect how he continued to view people. And I think we need to step into that and continue to be people that are reflecting that and accepting of people that are going through that, but also reflecting that Jesus walked through this world and he did not let that make him cynical. He welcomed those people and he said, these are your questioning or this, and it didn't affect his level of love that he gave or the way that he viewed people. And I think that our lens matters, but I think like how we're showing up to church matters too.
Yeah.
And at large, we can talk about it as a big institution that's worth trust or not trust, but each of us, has a part to play in how we model Jesus to our neighbors, right? And so like each of us plays a part in how people do or don't see the church. Am I loving my neighbors? Am I being somebody that actually looks like Jesus to them? Despite what their assumptions are, despite all of those things that they're bringing to the table, each of us has, I think, that responsibility, that God-given responsibility to look like, be like, act like Jesus. And unfortunately, a lot of the mistrust isn't necessarily even due to the large organization, but it's due to people that, speak or, got the tattoo or they rock the necklace or they're claiming Jesus in some kind of way publicly, but the way that they're actually living is something that seems radically different than somebody who's loving others, who's getting close to others, who's being there for people in the trenches when life isn't going well. And so for a lot of people, the biggest turnoff isn't the institution. It's the people that wear the label and wear the name that are fans of Jesus, but really they're not following him deeply with their lives. And those incongruencies are really in a lot of ways what drive people away. And so I think that's a big thing that we're like, okay, we're talking about it on a big grand level, the church as an organization, Big C Church, but each of us, I think, has to look and say, how do I take personal ownership of the facelift or the rebranding, whatever? I don't think Jesus needs rebranded, but how do I take personal ownership of how am I doing, in my circles? If you were bold enough to ask a neighbor who's a skeptic or somebody who works with you that's a skeptic, hey, based on my relationship with you, like, what do you think about Jesus? Like, what do you think, not what do you think about Jesus based on, everybody else, but based on just me and our relationship? Like, I think that's a scary question that a lot of people would be really intimidated to ask others in a public setting or an intimate private setting to their neighbors. And if that's a scary question, then I think we have some reflecting to do, because each of us does contribute in positive or negative ways to that.
I think you have to ask yourself, like, what is the importance of trustworthiness in a Christian's life? And I think it hurts our witness when we are easily succumb to lies or misinformation, and we just kind of become a parrot of the information that we hear, or we open up social media and someone says something and we find it, salacious or whatever, and we just repeat it. We don't actually take the time to know if that's true. I think like when I was a kid, the one thing I always heard was don't swallow your chewing gum because it depending on who you ask, it stays in your system for
Yep.
7 years, or it stays whatever. All these are quicksand because of all the movies we watched. I thought quicksand was going to get me eventually, and I think that stuff is kind
Yeah.
of silly, but it's like these things that are perpetuated, these small little
Yep.
wives' tales or urban legends, and they would spread like wildfire even before the internet, right? These things would just go everywhere. And as a Christian, I don't think it's our job to be like the police of knowing all the facts and all of that, but also like hold these things open-handed when you're representing yourself to the outside world. Because if we always come across as know-it-alls and like we have the answer and we have this and we know that and you're wrong and this, it is not a very inviting place or presence to inhabit. And I think that the world is always going to rail against that. And so if we want to be more Christ-like, we can have discourse with people. We can talk about things. We can have our beliefs challenged and challenge others' beliefs. But I think as long as we're doing that respectfully and realizing that ultimately we might be wrong about something and that's okay. I think that's really, it like starts with us, right? I think that's kind of what you were saying, Alex. Like it really starts with us. Like how, if we're not as Christians, if people don't find us trustworthy, then what does that mean for how we're representing Christ?
And I think that the idea of what is true. I mean, I think truth, seeking what truth is, ultimately what I think most people are. And you've got phrases like my truth and all that kind of things. But I think the reality is truth cannot evolve. Like truth has to be, if it's a truth, I mean, to be an absolute truth, it has to be the same truth in the United States of America in 2026 as it is in Nepal in 2026, or it has to be the same truth in 2026 as it was in 250 years ago when our nation was founded and thousands of years ago across the globe before anybody really knew about America. And so I think a lot of ways we have to get back to the basics of, okay, what are the foundational ultimate truths of humanity and things that we're seeking. I think Romans talks about, some of those things in the beginning of Romans, of the actual truths that God has revealed to us in creation and ultimately in him and so on and so forth. And so I think that's a big part of the conversation is what is truth? Where do we find truth? How do we seek truth? Scripture would offer to us, if we seek truth, then we will find truth. I think the difference is a lot of us are seeking truth that comforts us, kind of like you were talking about, Eric. But
is that a truth that changes us?
But the more you actually seek truth, the more you realize I'm kind of out of line with truth, and I need to. But if truth is truth, then I'm the one that has to get behind what truth is, and not the other way around. And so I think it just becomes such a moving target.
But it goes
so
back to
ambiguous.
that independence too, though. Because it's like, well, like you said, this is my truth. And I mean, that's come off as a term that's maybe used by certain people, but a lot of times the people who criticize that term are also living in their truths.
In some way.
In their own way. And so I think it's just realizing the irony in all of it, and that, really humility is the only way out of this. I mean, that's why Christ led people. That's really our only way out, is going, I might have been wrong about that, and move on. It doesn't hurt anyone to admit when you're wrong.
It hurts some people to admit when they're wrong.
It does, but I mean, really,
I get what
you know
you're
what I mean,
saying.
though?
Yes, yes.
Ultimately, it doesn't.
Yes.
Like if that can heal a relationship, if that can mend a relationship between a father and a son or whatever, like, I mean, if that can, or you can get along with your neighbor now, whatever, it's like the benefit outweighs the hurt. It hurts your ego. Yeah, right. It does. And that's the part that stings. But like for what, the betterment of what, and like the good that comes from that, I think always outweighs the cost. I don't know. We covered a lot of ground. I'm not sure what type of cherry we want to put on this, maraschino or
I like those.
a
Those
black
are
cherry.
nice.
I don't know.
Well, I think even the other parts that we didn't talk about is, I mean, people are just able to give their opinions. I mean, 4 or 5 star, like all of these things, like rating and scales and all of this stuff kind of is more and more of living in a world that's kind of always just saying you can declare what truth is, and surveys declare what truth is, and 4 and 5 star ratings declare what truth is. And then you're like, all these companies that just have fake people that just do all of these things. And so then you're like, I can't even trust Yelp anymore because they've got all their bots that they're buying. It's just this constant thing of, and if we're seeking truth ultimately in culture and the world and all of those things, then it's just going to be a shifting, moving target all of the time.
Right.
And so, as Christians, that's why it is, I think, important for us to come back to who is truth. The way, the truth, and life is Christ. And again, like you said, Eric, I think have those honest conversations for us to figure out, okay, how much is my life orbiting around truth, or how much is quote unquote truth orbiting around my life? And those are difficult questions. Those are soul searching, deep questions that we can't answer for everyone here.
No, they can only answer them themselves. A little help from the Holy Spirit. All right. Did we do it? Jess, do you have any closing thoughts? Where's your head at?
I'm just thinking about that when we are pursuing truth, I'm thinking of the verse. It's Matthew 5:16. It says, "Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." And that's ultimately, I think, what we're talking about when we're pursuing truth. That comes from not just our words, but we show our character and our actions. And I think that that's ultimately what we want to pursue.
Yeah.
And to me, it can be very simple. It's like keeping your word even when it's convenient. Like you said, admitting a mistake when it's tough, keeping your word even when, like, it'd be easier, telling the truth when it's easier to lie. Those are ways where it's like when we pursue those little steps, it's like we are pursuing Jesus, and we're going to change that narrative, even if it's for our world and our little world and our community.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, I think that does it for today's episode. We appreciate everybody for sticking in there and listening. And hopefully, this challenges you in a good way and gives you something to think about. One thing that we did want to mention before we leave you is that we will be going on our summer break. This will be your last episode. You'll hear from us for a little bit. You can expect us back in your podcast feeds probably in August sometime. But thank you for all the support and listening. And if you have any questions or concerns, you want to reach out to us, maybe you want to fill up our inbox with voicemails, you can do that. You could call and leave us a voicemail at 402-885-9930. You can leave us an email at podcast@cccomaha.org, or you can go to social media and find us there. You can follow us, comment, send us a message at CCCOMA podcast on Instagram or TikTok. Or maybe, if you're really missing us and you want something to do, you could leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. That always helps people find us, or share it with a friend. But until next time, which will be a little bit longer than normal, but until next time, we'll talk to you then.